The Secret Doctrine by Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, a facsimile of the original edition of 1888, printed by the Cunningham Press, Alhambra, California. Book 2, Part 1, Anthropogenesis, stanzas translated with commentaries, from the Secret Book of John. Stanza 10 continued. Verse 40. Then the third and fourth races became tall with pride. We are the kings, we are the gods. Such were the first truly physical men, whose first characteristic was pride. It is the third race and the gigantic Atlanteans, the memory of whom lingered from one generation and race to another generation and race down to the days of Moses, and which found an objective form in those antediluvian giants, whose terrible sorcerers and magicians, of whom the Roman Church has preserved such vivid and at the same time distorted legends. One who has read and studied the commentaries on the archaic doctrine will easily recognize in some Atlanteans the prototypes of the Nimrods, the builders of the Tower of Babel, the Hamites, and all these tutti quanti of accursed memory, as theological literature expresses it, of those, in short, who have furnished posterity with the orthodox types of Satan. And this leads us naturally to inquire into the religious ethics of these early races, mythical as these may be. What was the religion of the third and fourth races? In the common acceptation of the term, neither the Lemurians nor yet their progeny, the Lemuro-Atlanteans, had any, as they knew no dogma, nor had they to believe on faith. No sooner had the mental eye of man been opened to understanding than the third race felt itself one with the ever-present, as the ever to be unknown and invisible all, the one universal deity. Endowed with divine powers and feeling in himself his inner God, each felt he was a man-god in his nature, though an animal in his physical self. The struggle between the two began from the very day they tasted of the fruit of the tree of wisdom, a struggle for life between the spiritual and the psychic and the physical. Those who conquered the lower principles by obtaining mastery over the body joined the sons of light. Those who fell victims to their lower natures became the slaves of matter. From sons of light and wisdom, they ended by becoming the sons of darkness. They had fallen in the battle of mortal life with life immortal, and all those so fallen became the seed of the future generations of Atlanteans. Note: the name is used here in the sense of, and as a synonym of, sorcerers. The Atlantean races were many, and lasted in their evolution for millions of years. All were not bad. They became so toward their end, as we, the fifth, are fast becoming now. End of note. At the dawn of his consciousness, the man of the third root race had thus no beliefs that could be called religion. This is to say, he was equally as ignorant of gay religions full of pomp and gold as of any system of faith or outward worship. But if the term is to be defined as the binding together of the masses in one form of reverence paid to those we feel higher than ourselves, of a piety, as a feeling expressed by a child toward a loved parent, then even the earliest Lemurians had a religion, and a most beautiful one from the very beginning of their intellectual life. Had they not their bright gods of the elements around them, and even within themselves? Note: the gods of the elements are by no means the elementals. The latter are at best used by them as vehicles and materials in which to clothe themselves. End of note. Was not their childhood passed with, nursed, and tended by those who had given them life and called them forth to intelligent conscious life? We are assured it was so, and we believe it. For the evolution of spirit into matter could never have been achieved, nor would it have received its first impulse, had not the bright spirits sacrificed their own respective super-ethereal essences to animate the man of clay, by endowing each of his inner principles with a portion, or rather reflection, of that essence. The Dionys of the seven heavens, the seven planes of being, are the noumenoi of the actual and the future elements, just as the angels of the seven powers of nature, the grosser effects of which are perceived by us in what science is pleased to call the modes of motion, the imponderable forces and what not, are the still higher noumenoi of still higher hierarchies. It was the golden age in those days of old, the age when the gods walked the earth and mixed freely with the mortals. Since then the gods departed, that is, became invisible, and later generations ended by worshipping their kingdoms, the elements. It was the Atlanteans, the first progeny of semi-divine man after his separation into sexes, hence the first begotten and humanly born mortals, who became the first sacrifices to the god of matter. They stand in the far-away dim past, in ages more than prehistoric, as the prototype on which the great symbol of Cain was built, as the first anthropomorphists who worshipped form and matter. That worship degenerated very soon into self-worship, thence led to phallicism, or that which reigns supreme to this day in the symbolisms of every exoteric religion of ritual, dogma, and form. Adam and Eve became matter, or furnished the soil. Cain and Abel, the latter the life-bearing soil, the former the tiller of that ground or field. First the Atlantean races, born on the Lemurian continent, separated from their earliest tribes into the righteous and the unrighteous, into those who worshipped the one unseen spirit of nature, the ray which man feels within himself, or the pantheists, and those who offered fanatical worship to the spirits of the earth, the dark cosmic anthropomorphic powers with whom they made alliance. These were the earliest Gibborim, the mighty men of renown in those days, from Genesis chapter 6, who became with the fifth race, Kabiri with the Egyptians and the Phoenicians, Titans with the Greeks, and Rakshasas and Daityas with the Indian races. Such was the secret and mysterious origin of all the subsequent and modern religions, especially of the worship of the later Hebrews for their tribal god. At the same time, this sexual religion was closely allied to, based upon and blended, so to say, with astronomical phenomena. The Lemurians gravitated toward the North Pole, or the heaven of their progenitors, the Hyperborean continent. The Atlanteans toward the Southern Pole, the pit, cosmically and terrestrially, whence breathe the hot passions blown into hurricanes by the cosmic elementals whose abode it is. The two poles were denominated by the ancients dragons and serpents, hence good and bad dragons and serpents, and also the name given to the sons of God, sons of spirit and matter, the good and bad magicians. This is the origin of this dual and triple nature in man. The legend of the fallen angels, in its esoteric signification, contains the key to the manifold contradictions of human character. It points to the secret of man's self-consciousness. It is the angle iron on which hinges his entire life cycle, the history of his evolution and growth. On a firm grasp of this doctrine depends the correct understanding of esoteric anthropogenesis. It gives a clue to the vexed question of the origin of evil, and shows how man himself is the separator of the one into various contrasted aspects. The reader, therefore, will not be surprised if so considerable space is devoted in each case to an attempt to elucidate this difficult and obscure subject. A good deal must necessarily be said on its symbological aspect, because by doing so hints are given to the thoughtful student for his own investigations, and more light can thus be suggested than it is possible to convey in the technical phrases of a more formal philosophical exposition. The fallen angels, so-called, are humanity itself. The demon of pride, lust, rebellion, and hatred has never had any being before the appearance of physical conscious man. It is man who has begotten, nurtured, and allowed the fiend to develop in his heart. He, again, who has contaminated the indwelling God in himself by linking the pure spirit with the impure demon of matter. And if the Kabbalistic saying, Demon est Deus inversus, finds its metaphysical and theoretical corroboration in dual manifested nature, its practical application is found in mankind alone. Thus it has now become self-evident that, postulating as we do A, the appearance of man before that of other mammalia, and even before the ages of the huge reptiles, B, periodical deluges and glacial periods owing to the karmic disturbance of the axis, and chiefly C, the birth of man from a superior being, or what materialism would call a supernatural being, though it is only superhuman. It is evident that our teachings have very few changes of an impartial hearing. Add to it the claim that a portion of the mankind in the third race, all those monads of men who had reached the highest point of merit and karma in the preceding manvantara, owed their psychic and rational natures to divine beings hypostasizing into their fifth principles, and the secret doctrine must lose caste in the eyes of not only materialism, but even of dogmatic Christianity. For no sooner will the latter have learned that those angels are identical with their fallen spirits, than the esoteric tenet will be proclaimed most terribly heretical and pernicious. Note: it is perhaps with an eye to this degradation of the highest and purest spirits, who broke through the intermediate planes of low consciousness, the 7 circles of fire of Himanda, that St. James is made to say that this wisdom, psyche in the original, descended not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. And psyche is manas, the human soul, the spiritual wisdom of soul being buddhi. Yet buddhi per se, being so near the absolute, is only latent consciousness. End of note. The divine man dwelt in the animal, and therefore, when the physiological separation took place in the natural course of evolution, when also all the animal creation was united, and males were attracted to females, that race fell, not because they had eaten of the fruit of knowledge and knew good from evil, but because they knew no better. Propelled by the sexless creative instinct, the early subraces had evolved an intermediate race in which, as hinted in the stanzas, the higher Dhyan had incarnated. Note: this is the undying race, as it is called in esotericism, and exoterically the fruitless generation of the first progeny of Daksha, who curses Narada, the divine rishi, alleged to have dissuaded the Haryashvas and the Sabalashvas, the sons of Daksha, from procreating their species by saying, "Be born in the womb, there shall not be a resting place for thee in all these regions." After this, Narada, the representative of that race of fruitless ascetics, is said as soon as he dies in one body to be reborn in another. And a note: when we have ascertained the extent of the universe and learnt to know all that there is in it, we will multiply our race, answer the sons of will and yoga to their brethren of the same race, who invite them to do as they do. This means that the great adepts and initiated ascetics will multiply, that is, once more produce mind-born immaculate sons in the 7th root race. It is so stated in the Puranas, in Adiparvan, page 150, and Brahma Purana, etc. In one portion of the Pushkara Mahatmya, moreover, the separation of the sexes is allegorized by Daksha, who, seeing that his will-born progeny, the sons of passive yoga, will not create men, converts half himself into a female, by whom he begets daughters, the future females of the 3rd race, which beget the giants of Atlantis, the 4th race, so called. In the Vishnu Purana it is simply said that Daksha, the father of mankind, established sexual intercourse as the means of peopling the world. Happily for the human race, the elect race had already become the vehicle of incarnation of the intellectually and spiritually highest dhyanis before humanity had become quite material. When the last sub-races, save some lowest of the 3rd race, had perished with the great Lemurian continent, the seeds of the Trinity of Wisdom had already acquired the secret of immortality on earth, that gift which allows the same great personality to step ad libitum from one worn-out body into another. Verse 41. They took wives fair to look at, wives from the mindless, the narrow-headed. They bred monsters, wicked demons, male and female. Also Kadu, Dakim, with little minds. The first war that earth knew, the first human gore shed, was the result of man's eyes and senses being opened, which made him see that daughters of his brethren were fairer than his own, and their wives also. There were rapes committed before that of the Sabines, and Menelaus's robbed of their Helens before the 5th race was born. Titans or giants were the stronger, their adversaries the wiser. This took place during the 4th race, that of the giants. For there were giants in the days of old indeed, and the evolutionary series of the animal world is a warrant that the same thing took place within the human races. Note: The traditions of every country and nation point to this fact. Donnelly quotes from Father Duran's Historia Antigua de la Nueva España of 1885, in which a native of Cholula, a centenarian, accounts for the building of the Great Pyramid of Cholula by saying as follows: "In the beginning, before the light of the sun had been created, this land, Cholula, was in obscurity and darkness. But immediately after the light of the sun arose in the east, there appeared gigantic men who built the said pyramid, its builders being scattered after that to all parts of the earth." A great deal of the Central American history is taken up with the doings of an ancient race of giants called Quinañes, says the author of Atlantis, page 204. End of note. Lower still in the order of creation we find witnesses for the same in the flora going pari passu with the fauna in respect of size. The pretty ferns we collect and dry among the leaves of our favorite volumes are the descendants of the gigantic ferns which grew during the Carboniferous period. Scriptures and fragments of philosophical and scientific works, in short almost every record that has come down to us from antiquity, contain references to giants. No one can fail to recognize the Atlanteans of the secret doctrine in the Rakshasas of Lanka, the opponents conquered by Rama. Are these accounts no better than the production of empty fancy? Let us give the subject a few moments of attention. Are giants a fiction? Here again we come into collision with science. The latter denies, so far, that man has ever been much larger than the average of the tall and powerful men one meets with occasionally now. Dr. Henry Gregor denounces such traditions as resting upon ill-digested facts. Instances of mistaken judgments are brought forward. Thus, in 1613, in a locality called from time immemorial the Field of Giants in the Lower Dauphiné in France, 4 miles from Saint-Romain, enormous bones were found deeply buried in the sandy soil. They were attributed to human remains, and even to Teutoburchus, the Teuton chief slain by Marius. But Cuvier's later research proved them to be the fossil remains of the Dinotherium giganteum of the family of tapirs, 18 feet long. Ancient buildings are pointed to as an evidence that our earliest ancestors were not much larger than we are, the entrance doors being of no larger size then than they are now. The tallest man of antiquity known to us was the Roman Emperor Maximus, we are told, whose height was only 7.5 feet. Nevertheless, in our modern day we see every year men taller than this. The Hungarian who exhibited himself in the London Pavilion was nearly 9 feet high. In America a giant was shown 9.5 feet tall. The Montenegrin Danilo was 8 feet 7 inches. In Russia and Germany one often sees men in the lower classes above 7 feet. And as the ape theorists are told by Mr. Darwin that the species of animals which result from crossbreeding always betray a tendency to revert to the original type, they ought to apply the same law to men. Had there been no giants as a rule in ancient day, there would be none now. All this applies only to the historic period. And if the skeletons of the prehistoric ages have failed so far, which is positively denied, to prove undeniably in the opinion of science the claim here advanced, it is but a question of time. Moreover, as already stated, human stature is little changed since the last glacial cycle. The giants of old are all buried under the oceans, and hundreds of thousands of years of constant friction by water would reduce to dust and pulverize a brazen, far more a human skeleton. But whence the testimony of well-known classical writers, of philosophers and men who otherwise never had the reputation for lying? Let us bear in mind, furthermore, that before the year 1847, when Boucher de Perthes forced it upon the attention of science, almost nothing was known of fossil man, for archaeology complacently ignored his existence. Of giants who were in the earth in those days of old, the Bible alone has spoken to the wise men of the West, the zodiac being the solitary witness called upon to corroborate the statement in the persons of Atlas or Orion, whose mighty shoulders are said to support the world. Nevertheless, even the giants have not been left without their witnesses, and one may as well examine both sides of the question. The 3 sciences, geological, sidereal, and scriptural, the latter in its universal character, may furnish us with the needed proofs. To begin with geology, it has already confessed that the older the excavated skeletons, the larger, taller, and the more powerful their structure. This is already a certain proof in hand. All those bones, writes Frédéric de Rougemont, who, though believing too piously in Noah's Ark and the Bible, is none the less a scientific witness. All those skeletons found in the departments of the Gard, in Austria, Liège, etc., etc., those skulls which remind all of the Negro type, and which by reason of that type might be mistaken for animals, have all belonged to men of very high stature. See Histoire de la Terre, page 154. The same is repeated by Larté, an authority who attributes a tall stature to those who were submerged in the deluge, not necessarily Noah's, and a smaller stature to the races which lived subsequently. As for the evidence furnished by ancient writers, we need not stop at that of Tertullian, who assures us that in his day a number of giants were found at Carthage. For before his testimony can be accepted, his own identity and actual existence would have to be proven. Note, there are critics who, finding no evidence in the existence of Tertullian save in the writings of Eusebius the Veracious, are inclined to doubt it. End of note. But we may turn to the scientific journals of 1858, which spoke of a sarcophagus of giants found that year on the site of that same city. As to the ancient pagan writers, we have the evidence of Philostratus, who speaks of a giant skeleton 22 cubits long, as well as of another of 12 cubits seen by himself at Sigius. This skeleton may perhaps not have belonged, as believed by Protesilaus, to the giant killed by Apollo at the siege of Troy. Nevertheless, it was that of a giant as well as that other one discovered by Mesocrates of Styre at Lemnos, horrible to behold, according to Philostratus, in Heroica, page 35. Is it possible that prejudice would carry science so far as to class all these men as either fools or liars? Pliny speaks of a giant in whom he thought he recognized Orion, the son of Ephialtes, Natural History, Volume 7, Chapter 16. Plutarch declares that Sertorius saw the tomb of Antaeus, the giant, and Pausanias vouches for the actual existence of the tombs of Asturius and of Geryon, Ohilus, son of Hercules, all giants, titans, and mighty men. Finally, the Abbé Peg, cited in de Merville's Pneumatologie, affirms in his curious work on the volcanoes of Greece that in the neighborhood of the volcanoes of the Isle of Thera, giants with enormous skulls were found laid out under colossal stones, the erection of which must have necessitated everywhere the use of titanic powers, and which tradition associates in all countries with the ideas about giants, volcanoes, and magic. See page 48. In the same work above cited of the Abbé Pege, the author wonders why in Bible and tradition the Gibborim, giants, the mighty ones, the Rephaim, or the spectres, phantoms, the Nephilim, or the fallen ones, Iruentes, are shown as if identical, though they are all men, since the Bible calls them the primitive and the mighty ones, for example Nimrod. The Doctrine explains the secret. These names, which belong by right only to the 4 preceding races and the earliest beginning of the 5th, allude very clearly to the first 2 phantom astral races, to the fallen one, the 3rd, and to the race of the Atlantean giants, the 4th, after which men began to decrease in stature. Bossuet in Elevation, page 56, sees the cause of subsequent universal idolatry in the original sin. Ye shall be as gods, says the serpent of Genesis to Eve, thus laying the first germ of the worship of false divinities. Hence, he thinks, came idolatry, or the cult and adoration of images, of anthropomorphized or human figures. But if it is the latter that idolatry is made to rest upon, then the 2 churches, the Greek and the Latin especially, are as idolatrous and pagan as any other religion. Note, and that notwithstanding the formal prohibition at the great church council of Illyris in AD 303, when it was declared that the form of God, which is immaterial and invisible, shall not be limited by figure or shape. In 692, the Council of Constantinople had similarly prohibited to paint or represent Jesus as a lamb, as also to bow the knee in praying, as it is the act of idolatry. But the Council of Nicaea brought this idolatry back, while that of Rome in 1883 excommunicated John, the Patriarch of Constantinople, for his showing himself a declared enemy of image worship. End of note. It is only in the fourth race that men who had lost all right to be considered divine resorted to body worship, in other words to phallicism. Till then they had been truly gods, as pure and as divine as their progenitors, and the expression of the allegorical serpent does not, as sufficiently shown in the preceding pages, refer at all to the physiological fall of men, but to their acquiring the knowledge of good and evil, which knowledge comes to them prior to their fall. It must not be forgotten that it is only after his forced expulsion from Eden that Adam knew Eve his wife. Genesis 4. It is not, however, by the dead letter of the Hebrew Bible that we shall check the tenets of the secret doctrine, but point out rather the great similarities between the two in their esoteric meaning. It is only after his defection from the Neoplatonists that Clement of Alexandria began to translate gigantes by serpentes, explaining that serpents and giants signify demons. Genesis chapter 5. Note. Treating of the Chinese dragon and the literature of China, Mr. Gould writes in his Mythical Monsters on page 212, its mythologies, histories, religions, popular stories and proverbs all teem with references to a mysterious being who has a physical nature and spiritual attributes. Gifted with an accepted form, which he has the supernatural power of casting off for the assumption of others, he has the power of influencing the weather, producing droughts or fertilizing rains at pleasure, of raising tempests and allaying them. Volumes could be compiled from the scattered legends which everywhere abound relating to this subject. Unquote, from Mr. Gould. This, quote, mysterious being, unquote, is the mythical dragon. That is the symbol of the historical, actual adept, the master and professor of occult sciences of old. It is stated already elsewhere that the great magicians of the fourth and fifth races were generally called the serpents and the dragons after their progenitors. All these belong to the hierarchy of the so-called fiery dragons of wisdom, the Diankochans answering to the Agnishvata Pitris, the Maruts, and Rudras generally, as the issue of Rudra, their father, identified with the god of fire. More is said in the next. Now Clement, an initiated Neoplatonist, knew of course the origin of the word dragon, and why the initiated adepts were so called, as he knew the secret of Agathodamon, the Christ, the seven-voweled serpent of the Gnostics. He knew that the dogma of his new faith required the transformation of all the rivals of Jehovah, the angels supposed to have rebelled against that Elohim, as the Titan Prometheus rebelled against Zeus, the usurper of his father's kingdom, and that dragon was the mystic appellation of the sons of wisdom. From this knowledge came his definition, as cruel as it was arbitrary: serpents and giants signify demons, that is, not spirits, but devils in church parlance. End of note. We may be told that before we draw parallels between our tenets and those of the Bible, we have to show better evidence of the existence of the giants of the fourth race than the reference to them found in Genesis. We answer that the proofs we give are more satisfactory, at any rate they belong to a more literary and scientific evidence than those of Noah's deluge will ever be. Even the historical works of China are full of such reminiscences about the fourth race. In Shu King, fourth part, chapter 27, page 291, anyone can read in the French translation, when the Mao Tse, that antediluvian and perverted race, explains the annotator, which had retired in the days of old to the rocky caves, and the descendants of whom are said to be still found in the neighborhood of Canton, according to our ancient documents, had, owing to the beguilements of Qi Yu, troubled all the earth. It became full of brigands. Note, what would you say to our affirmation that the Chinese, I speak of the inland, the true Chinaman, not of the hybrid mixture between the fourth and fifth races now occupying the throne, the aborigines who belong in their unallied nationality wholly to the highest and last branch of the fourth race, reached their highest civilization when the fifth had hardly appeared in Asia, from Esoteric Buddhism, page 67. And this handful of the inland Chinese are all of a very high stature. Could the most ancient manuscripts in the Lolo language, that of the Aborigines of China, be got at and translated correctly, many a priceless piece of evidence would be found. But they are as rare as their language is unintelligible. So far, 1 or 2 European archaeologists only have been able to produce such priceless works. End of note. The Lord Chang Ti, a king of the divine dynasty, saw that his people had lost the last vestiges of virtue. Then he commanded Taeyong and Li, 2 lower Diankochans, to cut away every communication between heaven and earth. Since then there was no more going up and down. Note. Remember the same statement in the book of Enoch, as also the ladder seen by Jacob in his dream. The 2 worlds mean, of course, the 2 planes of consciousness and being. A seer can commune with beings of a higher plane than earth without quitting his armchair. End of note. Going up and down means an untrammeled communication and intercourse between the 2 worlds. Not being in a position to give out a full and detailed history of the 3rd and 4th races, as many isolated facts concerning them as are permitted must be now collated together, especially those corroborated by direct as well as by inferential evidence found in ancient literature and history. As the coats of skin of men thickened, and they fell more and more into physical sin, the intercourse between physical and ethereal divine man was stopped. The veil of matter between the 2 planes became too dense for even the inner man to penetrate. The mysteries of heaven and earth revealed to the 3rd race by their celestial teachers in the days of their purity became a great focus of light, the rays from which became necessarily weakened as they were diffused and shed upon an uncongenial, because too material soil. With the masses they degenerated into sorcery, taking later on the shape of exoteric religions, of idolatry full of superstitions, and man or hero worship. Alone a handful of primitive men, in whom the spark of divine wisdom burnt bright, and only strengthened in its intensity as it got dimmer and dimmer with every age in those who turned it to bad purposes, remained the elect custodians of the mysteries revealed to mankind by the divine teachers. There were those among them who remained in their Kumaric condition from the beginning, and tradition whispers what the secret teachings affirm, namely, that these elect were the germ of the hierarchy which never died since that period. Quote, the inner man of the first ... only changes in his body from time to time. He is ever the same, knowing neither rest nor nirvana, spurning Devakan and remaining constantly on earth for the salvation of mankind. Out of the 7 virgin men, the Kumara, 4 sacrificed themselves for the sins of the world and the instruction of the ignorant, to remain till the end of the present Manvantara. Vide Supra the commentary on the 4 races, and on the sons of will and yoga, the immaculate progeny of the androgynous 3rd race. End of note. Though unseen, they are ever present. When people say of one of them, he is dead, behold, he is alive and under another form. These are the head, the heart, the soul, and the seed of undying knowledge. Gnana, thou shalt never speak, Ulanu, of these great ones, Maha ... before a multitude mentioning them by their names. The wise alone will understand. Unquote. From Catechism of the Inner Schools. Note. In the Kabbalah, the pronunciation of the 4-lettered ineffable name is a most secret arcanum, a secret of secrets. End of note. It is these sacred 4 who have been allegorized and symbolized in the Lingua Purana, which states that Vamadeva, Shiva, as a Kumara, is reborn in each kalpa, race in this instance, as 4 youths, 4 white, 4 red, 4 yellow, and 4 darker brown. Let us remember that Shiva is preeminently and chiefly an ascetic, the patron of all yogis and adepts, and the allegory will become quite comprehensible. It is the spirit of divine wisdom and chaste asceticism itself which incarnates in these elect. It is only after getting married and being dragged by the gods from his terrible ascetic life that Rudra becomes Shiva, a god, and not one of a very virtuous or merciful type in the Hindu pantheon. Higher than the four is only one, on earth as in heaven, that still more mysterious and solitary being described in Book 1. We have now to examine the nature of the sons of the flame and of dark wisdom, as well as the pros and cons of the satanic assumption. Such broken sentences as could be made out from the fragments of the title, which George Smith calls The Curse After the Fall, see page 81 of his Chaldean account of Genesis, are of course allegorical, yet they corroborate that which is taught of the true nature of the fall of the angels in our books. Thus it is said in line 12 that the Lord of the earth, his name called out, the Father Elu, Elohim, and pronounced his curse which the god Hea heard, and his liver was angry, because his man, angelic man, had corrupted his purity, 14 and 15, for which Hea expresses the desire that wisdom and knowledge hostilely may they injure him, man. The latter sentence points to the direct connection of the Chaldean with the genetic account, while Hea tries to bring to naught the wisdom and knowledge gained by man through his newly acquired intellectual and conscious capacity of creating in his turn, thus taking the monopoly of creation out of the hands of God, the gods. The Elohim do the same in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Therefore the Elohim sent him out of Eden. But this was of no avail, for the spirit of divine wisdom being upon and in man, verily the serpent of eternity and all knowledge, that manasic spirit, which made him learn the secret of creation on the Kriya Shaktik and of procreation on the earthly planes, led him as naturally to discover his way to immortality, notwithstanding the jealousy of all the gods. The early Atlanto-Lemurians are charged with taking unto themselves divine incarnations, wives of a lower race, namely the race of the hitherto mindless men. Every ancient scripture has the same, more or less disfigured legend. Primarily, the angelic fall, which has transformed the firstborn of God into the Asuras, or into the Ahriman and Typhon of the pagans, that is, if the accounts given in the book of Enoch and in Hermes, in Puranas and Bible are taken literally, when read esoterically, means simply this. Sentences such as, in his, Satan's, ambition, he raises his hand against the sanctuary of the God of heaven, etc., ought to read, prompted by the law of eternal evolution and karma, the angel incarnated on earth in man, and as his wisdom and knowledge are still divine, although his body is earthly, he is allegorically accused of divulging the mysteries of heaven. He combines and uses the two for purposes of human instead of superhuman procreation. Henceforth man will beget, not create. Notes. Note on the accounts given in the book of Enoch. Returning once more to the most important subject in the archaic cosmogony, it may be said that, even in the Norse legends, in the sacred scrolls of the goddess Saga, we find Loki, the brother by blood of Odin, as Typhon, Ahriman and others are brothers of Osiris and Ormazd, becoming evil only later when he has mixed too long with humanity. Like all other fire or light gods, fire burning and destroying, as well as warming and giving life, he ended by being accepted in the destructive sense of fire. The name Loki, we learn, Asgard and the gods, page 250, has been derived from the old word Lycian, to enlighten. It has therefore the same origin as the Latin lux, light. Hence Loki is identical with Lucifer, light bringer. This title, given to the Prince of Darkness, is very suggestive and is a vindication in itself against theological slander. But Loki is still more closely related to Prometheus, as he is shown chained to a sharp rock, while Lucifer, identified with Satan, was chained down in hell, a circumstance, however, which prevented neither of them from acting in all freedom on earth, if we accept the theological paradox in its fullness. Loki is a beneficent, generous and powerful god in the beginning of times, and the principle of good, not of evil, in early Scandinavian theogony. End of note. And note on, henceforth man will beget, not create. The Greek mythos just alluded to a few pages back, namely the mutilation of Uranus by his son Kronos in the Greek theogony, is an allusion to this theft by the sun of the earth and heavens of the divine creative fire. If Uranus, the personification of the celestial powers, has to stop creating, he is made impotent by Kronos, the god in time. So, in the Egyptian cosmogony, it is Tot, the god of wisdom, who regulates this fight between Horus and Set, the latter being served by the former, as Uranus is by Kronos. See Book of the Dead, chapter 17, verse 26. In the Babylonian account, it is the god Zu who strips the father of the gods, of Umsimi, the ideal creative organ, not the crown, within brackets exclamation mark, as G. Smith thought. See pages 115 and 116, Chaldean account. For in the fragment K3454 of the British Museum, it is said very clearly that Zu, having stripped the venerable of heaven of his desire, he carried away the Umsimi of the gods, and burnt thereby the Teroti, the power, of all the other gods, thus governing the seed of all the angels. 15. As the Umsimi was on the seat of Bel, it could hardly be the crown. A fourth version is in the Bible. Ham is the Chaldean Zu, and both are cursed for the same allegorically described crime. End of note. But as, by so doing, he has to use his weak body as the means of procreation, that body will pay the penalty for this wisdom, carried from heaven down to the earth. Hence the corruption of physical purity will become a temporary curse. The medieval Kabbalists knew this well, since one of them did not fear to write, quote, "The Kabbalah was first taught by God himself to a select company of angels who formed a theosophic school in paradise. After the fall, the angels most graciously communicated this heavenly doctrine to the disobedient child of earth, to furnish their protoplasts with the means of returning to their pristine nobility and felicity," unquote. Quoted by Christian Ginsper from the Kabbalah. This shows how the event of the sons of God marrying and imparting the divine secrets of heaven to the daughters of men, allegorically told by Enoch, and in the 6th chapter of Genesis was interpreted by the Christian Kabbalists. The whole of this period may be regarded as the pre-human period, that of divine man, or, as plastic Protestant theology now has it, the pre-Adamite period. But even Genesis begins its real history, chapter 6, by the giants of those days and the sons of God marrying and teaching their wives the daughters of man. This period is the one described in the Puranas, and relating as it does to days lost in archaic ages, hence prehistoric, how can any anthropologist feel certain whether the mankind of that period was or was not as he knows it now? The whole personnel of the Brahmanas and Puranas, the Rishis, Prajapatis, Manus, their wives and progeny, belong to that pre-human period. All these are the seed of humanity, so to speak. It is around these sons of God, the mind-born, astral children of Brahma, that our physical frames have grown and developed to what they are now. For the Puranic histories of all those men are those of our monads in their various and numberless incarnations on this and other spheres, events perceived by the Shiva eye of the ancient seers, the third eye of our stanzas, and described allegorically. Later on they were disfigured for sectarian purposes, mutilated, but still left with a considerable groundwork of truth in them. Nor is the philosophy less profound in such allegories for being so thickly veiled by the overgrowth of fancy. But with the fourth race we reach the purely human period. Those who were hitherto semi-divine beings, self-imprisoned in bodies which were human only in appearance, became physiologically changed and took unto themselves wives who were entirely human and fair to look at, but in whom lower, more material, though sidereal beings had incarnated. These beings in female forms, Lilith is the prototype of these in the Jewish traditions, are called in the esoteric accounts Kadu, Dakini in Sanskrit. Allegorical legends call the chief of these Liliths Sangye Kadu, Buddha Dakini in Sanskrit. All are credited with the art of walking in the air, and the greatest kindness to mortals, but no mind, only animal instinct. Note: these are the beings whose legendary existence has served as groundwork upon which to build the rabbinical Lilith, and what the believers in the Bible would term the antediluvian women, and the Kabbalists the pre-Adamite races. They are no fiction, this is certain, however fantastic the exuberance of later growth. End of note. Stanza 10, verse 42. They built temples for human body. Male and female they worshipped. This is the beginning of a worship which, ages later, was doomed to degenerate into phallicism and sexual worship. It began by the worship of the human body, that miracle of miracles, as an English author calls it, and ended by that of its respective sexes. The worshippers were giants in stature, but they were giants in knowledge and learning, though it came to them more easily than it does to the men of our modern times. Their science was innate in them. The Lemur Atlantean had no need of discovering and fixing in his memory that which his informing principle knew at the moment of its incarnation. Time alone of the matter in which the principles had clothed themselves could, the one, weaken the memory of their prenatal knowledge, the other blunt and even extinguish every spark of the spiritual and divine in them. Therefore had they, from the first, fallen victims to their animal natures and bred, quote, monsters, unquote. That is, men of distinct varieties from themselves. Speaking of the giants, Kreutzer describes them well in saying that, quote, those children of heaven and earth were endowed at their birth by the sovereign powers, the authors of their being, with extraordinary faculties, both moral and physical. They commanded the elements, knew the secrets of heaven and the earth, of the sea and the whole world, and read futurity in the stars. It seems indeed as though one has to deal, when reading of them, not with men as we are, but with the spirits of the elements sprung from the bosom of nature and having full sway over her. All these beings are marked with the character of magic and sorcery, unquote. And so they were, those now legendary heroes of the prehistoric, still once really existing races. Kreutzer was wise in his generation, for he did not charge with deliberate deceit or dullness or superstition an endless series of recognized philosophers who mention these races and assert that, even in their own time, they saw their fossils. There were skeptics in days of old, no fewer and as great as they are now, but even a Lucian, a Democritus, and an Epicurus yielded to the evidence of facts, and showed the discriminative capacity of really great intellects, which can distinguish fiction from fact, and truth from exaggeration and fraud. Ancient writers were no more fools than our modern wise men are, for, as well remarked by the author of some Notes on Aristotle's Psychology in relation to modern thought, the common division of history into ancient and modern is misleading. The Greeks in the 4th century BC were in many respects moderns, especially, we may add, in their skepticism. They were not very likely to accept fables so easily, unquote. Yet the Lemurians and Atlanteans, those children of heaven and earth, were indeed marked with the character of sorcery, for the esoteric doctrine charges them precisely with that which, if believed, would put an end to the difficulties of science with regard to the origin of man, or rather his anatomical similarities to the anthropoid, ape. It accuses them of having committed the to us abominable crime of breeding with so-called animals, and thus producing a truly pithecoid species now extinct. Of course, as in the question of spontaneous generation, in which esoteric science believes and which it teaches, the possibility of such a crossbreed between man and an animal of any kind will be denied. But apart from the consideration that in those early days, as already remarked, neither the human Atlantean giants nor yet the quote animals unquote were the physiologically perfect men and mammalians that are now known to us. The modern notions upon this subject, those of the physiologists included, are too uncertain and fluctuating to permit them an absolute denial a priori of such a fact. A careful perusal of the commentaries would make one think that the being that the new, quote, incarnate, unquote, bred with was called an animal, not because he was no human being, but rather because he was so dissimilar physically and mentally to the more perfect races which had developed physiologically at an earlier period. Remember stanza 7, and what is said in its first verse, 24th. That when the sons of wisdom came to incarnate the first time, some of them incarnated fully, others projected into the forms only a spark, while some of the shadows were left over from being filled and perfected till the fourth race. Those races, then, which remained destitute of knowledge, or those again which were left mindless, remained as they were, even after the natural separation of the sexes. It is these who committed the first crossbreeding, so to speak, and bred monsters, and it is from the descendants of these that the Atlanteans chose their wives. Adam and Eve were supposed, with Cain and Abel, to be the only human family on earth. Yet we see Cain going to the land of Nod and taking their wife. Evidently one race only was supposed perfect enough to be called human, and even in our own day, while Sinhalese regard the Vedas of their jungles as speaking animals and no more, some British people believe firmly in their arrogance that every other human family, especially the Dark Indians, is an inferior race. Moreover, there are naturalists who have sincerely considered the problem whether some savage tribes, like the Bushmen for instance, can be regarded as men at all. The commentary says, in describing that species, or race of animals, fair to look at as a biped, having human shape, but having the low extremities, from the waist down, covered with hair, hence the race of the satyrs, perhaps. If men existed 2 million years ago, they must have been, just as the animals were, quite different physically and anatomically from what they have become, and they were nearer to the type of pure mammalian animal than they are now. Anyhow, we learn that the animal world breeds strictly inter se, that is, in accordance with genus and species, only since the appearance of this earth of the Atlantean race. As demonstrated by the author of that able work Modern Science and Modern Thought, this idea of the refusal to breed with another species, or that sterility is the only result of such breeding, appears to be a prima facie deduction rather than absolute law even now. He shows that different species do, in fact, often breed together, as may be seen in the familiar instances of the horse and ass. It is true that in this case the mule is sterile, but this rule is not universal, and recently one new hybrid race, that of the leoprine or hare rabbit, has been created, which is perfectly fertile. The progeny of wolf and dog is also instanced, as that of several other domestic animals. Page 101. Quote, like foxes and dogs again, and the modern Swiss cattle shown by Rutimeyer, as descended from 3 distinct species of fossil oxen, the Bos primigenius, Bos longifrons, and Bos frontosus. Yet some of those species, as the ape family, which so clearly resembles man in physical structure, contain, we are told, numerous branches which graduate into one another, but the extremes of which differ more widely than man does from the highest of the ape series. Unquote. The gorilla and chimpanzee, for instance. See addenda. Thus Mr. Darwin's remark, or shall we say the remark of Linnaeus, natura non facit saltum, is not only corroborated by esoteric science, but would, were there any chance of the real doctrine being accepted by any others than its direct votaries, reconcile in more than one way, if not entirely, the modern evolution theory which facts, as also with the absolute failure of the anthropologists to meet with the, quote, missing link, unquote, in our 4th round, geological formations. We will show elsewhere that, however unconsciously to itself, modern science pleads our case upon its own admissions, and that Descartes is perfectly right when he suggests, in his last work, that it is far more likely that the anthropoid ape should be discovered to be the descendant of man than that these two types should have a common fantastic and nowhere to be found ancestor. Thus the wisdom of the compilers of the old stanzas is vindicated by at least one eminent man of science, and the occultist prefers to believe, as he ever did, that, quote, man was the first and highest mammalian animal that appeared in this fourth round creation. Then came still huger animals, and last of all, the dumb man who walks on all fours. For the Rakshasas, giant demons, and Daityas, titans, of the White Dvipa continent, spoil his, the dumb man's, sires. Unquote. From commentary. Furthermore, as we see, there are anthropologists who have traced man back to an epoch which goes far to break down the apparent barrier that exists between the chronologies of modern science and the archaic doctrine. It is true that English scientists generally have declined to commit themselves to the sanction of the hypothesis of even a tertiary man. They, each and all, measure the antiquity of Homo primigenius by their own lights and prejudices. Huxley indeed ventured to speculate on a possible Pliocene or Miocene man. Professor Seaman and Mr. Grant Allen have relegated his advent to the Eocene. But, speaking generally, English scientists consider that we cannot safely go beyond the Quaternary. Unfortunately, the facts do not accommodate the too cautious reserve of these latter. The French school of anthropology, basing their views on the discoveries of l'Abbé Bourgeois, Capellini, and others, has accepted, almost without exception, the doctrine that the traces of our ancestors are certainly to be found in the Miocene, while M. de Quatrefages now inclines to postulate a secondary age man. Further on we shall compare such estimates with the figures given in the Brahminical exoteric books, which approximate to the esoteric teaching. Stanza 10, verse 42 continued. Then the third eye acted no longer. Then the third eye acted no longer, says the stanza, because man had sunk too deep into the mire of matter. What is the meaning of this strange and weird statement in verse 42 concerning the third eye of the third race, which had died and acted no longer? A few more occult teachings must now be given with reference, as well as some others. The history of the third and fourth races must be amplified, in order that it may throw some more light on the development of our present humanity, and show how the faculties call into activity by occult training restore man to the position he previously occupied in reference to spiritual perception and consciousness. But the phenomenon of the third eye has to be first explained. Next up is the races with the third eye.